hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles. I am your co host, and with me, as always, is my lifelong friend and co host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend Charles.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well. Today, we begin a very exciting new series, new author, new everything. We are beginning the Book of the Ancestor trilogy, starting with none other than Red Sister by Mark Lawrence.
Nailed it, Charles. I'm
Thank you.
pumped to get into this one. This is the result of a rousing, a space rousing
Thank you.
game of friends pitching fantasy that we had a little while back, and I pitched this to you. You
Mhm.
selected it, and here we are. We're gonna cover
That's
it.
right. Dylan, you'd read this a while back, so this is your second read through.
hmm
This is my first read through. I've read I've read one trilogy by Mark Lawrence. Which one is that where it's like Prince of Thorns, Emperor of Thorns,
Yeah, that's the Broken Empire
Broken
trilogy.
Empire. So I read Broken Empire trilogy. I thought it was great, which was a big part of why I chose Book of the Ancestor in the Friends Pitching Fantasy episode. And I'm glad I did because it was really entertaining, and no one writes fantasy like Mark Lawrence.
Hmm. Tell me more about what you mean by that, Charles. No one writes fantasy like Mark Lawrence?
Yeah, I just find his style to be very interesting and unique. First of all, Mark Lawrence, for those of you that don't know, his background is rather interesting. He's got like a PhD in math or something like that. He's like a full on scientist
He
and
was a former rocket
yeah,
scientist.
former rocket scientist,
Or
worked
he
on the
currently is a former rocket
yeah.
scientist. Say he was a former rocket scientist.
he well, he is a former rocket
Yes.
scientist. He was formerly a scientist, and he worked on like the Star Wars project and all that. So, his approach to fantasy has almost like a very sci-fi kind of aspect to it. He really gets into the nitty-gritty of in this case there's a school and a magic system, and his settings as well are always rather complex. uh, this one we're in like a frozen wasteland, but there's a sun that goes through this magnifying glass that heats up the a sliver of corridor.
Yeah.
Super interesting. I'm like, man, no one writes. It takes someone with a lifetime of math and science experience who then decides to write best-selling fantasy. There's only one person like that I know of, and that's Mark Lawrence. So it's really interesting stuff to kind of go through this book and be reminded of the unique setting that was in um, the Broken Empire as well. So yeah, just happy to be back in the mind of Mark Lawrence.
Yeah, that's so well said, Charles. It is very interesting that Mark Lawrence decided to write stuff that's primarily classified as fantasy, though it obviously has those sci-fi elements. It always seems to.
Right.
And the yeah, the choice is really interesting because you would think that someone with his background would be a natural fit for hard science fiction that really
Exactly.
gets into all the details of all of that.
Yeah.
But instead, he gives us just enough of that science fiction background to create some really interesting scenarios, like the ticking time bomb that is a dying sun
Right.
that just lights up the corridor through the moon, which is really a magnifying glass sort of thing that they send into
Right.
space, I guess.
It's
Um,
vaguely described.
yeah, so the whole thing there, Mark gives us what we need. He doesn't, though I'm 100% sure has all the knowledge to really dive into all of that. He never really makes the story about that, and I really appreciate that as more of a
Exactly.
fantasy character focused reader who would rather see what Mark Lawrence actually does do, which is give a lot of attention to these characters, and he fleshes them out with so much depth.
Exactly. I think one of the things, if I ever got the opportunity to ask Mark Lawrence a question, like one of the things I would love to know is why fantasy and why not
hmm
like why go into these swords and sorcery things. Like I'm sure that he draws on something he just that makes him like sword and sorcery, and he brings science fiction in, and like what makes it a fantasy book and not a science fiction book. Like, it's very interesting how he draws these lines, and like how all of his characters don't know anything about science, but they just happen to live in an environment heavily influenced by science fiction. So you see it through this fantasy lens of like, what if these characters were born into this world where someone had apparently launched spaceships and built a magnifying glass to keep the planet warm, and then lost all the technology, and now these people are in this uh like medieval like fantasy world trying to survive, and they don't understand the technology. So super interesting environments that he puts his characters in, and that's kind of how this book is introduced, right? Uh this cool setting that blends sci-fi and fantasy in such a unique way.
It definitely does, Charles. Well, shall we get into more of the
Yeah,
spoiler portion of our Buddy Read episode here and
let's do it.
just dive into all the plot points? So, a good time to tap out now if
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 you
you
haven't
haven't
read,
read this book
right.
because we're going to talk about all of it. So, oh, also, yeah, story. We fleshed out the saying there. We should also mention Nona. The
Yeah,
story mostly follows Nona as she is trained to be a killer nun at Sweet Mercy Convent. That's pretty much what this story's about. It's got some revenge elements and whatnot, but we'll get into the deets of all of that.
hmm,
So, Charles, I was figuring we could just vaguely follow the plot of this book while mentioning whatever things we think are worth discussing as
sure.
they come up. We'll play it fast and loose as we always do on the FDF podcast. But how's that sound?
That sounds good to me. Why don't you start us off with our first plot point here?
Sure. Well, it starts with the interlude, and it has an opening line that I know I posted as one of our first ever Reddit posts, or comments, that was in response to a post that asked about favorite opening lines, and I think people tend to use this one all the time
Hmm.
when they're describing their favorite opening lines. It's it is important when killing a nun to ensure that you bring an army of sufficient size. For Sister Thorn of the Sweet Mercy Convent, Lano, Texas, brought 200
I mean, how could you not, when talking about this book, bring up that first line? It's
men.
right away. You're like, what? If you're bringing 200 men to kill a nun, and it's like it's epicness around the way he phrased it, and brilliant. And I know, like, we've had conversations about first lines before, and even before that Reddit post, you've gone to that opening a bunch of times. That and the magician's opening line, but this one for sure has been a go-to, and I finally get to contextualize it. And I agree, it's a really terrific way to kind of introduce the story.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that it holds up, Charles. I do find most people, even after reading the story, they're like, "Yeah, that pretty much sets the stage
Yeah,
for."
like every Goodreads review
Yeah.
includes it as well. It's like it's hard to avoid it. I mean, it's such a strong opening.
So it starts high, and I think it keeps that momentum. And we pretty these interludes. I know you, Charles, don't usually love when Mark Lawrence's work gets timey wimey.
Yeah.
I was wondering, did you find these aspects more palatable in
Right.
Red Sister
So when
than
we
in
read,
Broken
like,
Empire?
we had read Broken Empire years ago before Friends Talking Fantasy, right? So we had these conversations in private about my kind of confusion, gripes with the back and forth, like, time jump structure of Broken Empire. So when we went into Friends Pitching Fantasy and you gave your pitch, my very first question was, look, is this one of those things where we're going to be going back and forth in time? And you're like, yes, but I think you'll like it. So I trusted your judgment on that one. And I have to say that I think we get like three different flashback kind of moments throughout the book, like or flash forwards, I should say, in the beginning, the middle, and the end.
Yeah.
And I thought they were great because I think Mark Lawrence did something clever with this one. He, changed the characters' names. He worked in this element of like, oh, nuns get new names when they're
Mm-hmm.
older, which so you get these characters come in, you don't know who Sister Thorn is, and you kind of forget
Yeah.
about her, and then it's not till like the middle of the book when um it's revealed that what's her name, it's like
Ara.
Ara, that Ara is
Arabella.
Arabella is revealed to name herself um Sister Thorn. So I
Mm-hmm.
liked that. And then as you went into these other flash forwards, you could see that there was this kind of falling out with all
Yeah.
of the sisters, and not every sister was introduced, right? In the middle one, you just know it's the first name starts with a C, and I already kind of had my
We'll get there.
suspicions on that
Yeah.
one, and we'll get there. And then the last one, it introduced like maybe one other, so it didn't give away anything about the plot, right? With Broken Empire, it was like the same, the main character was in the flash forwards, so you're like, when he's in these high stakes situations, you're like, it's not like he's, not gonna so I had like those issues with Broken Empire, but those issues totally gone with these. And I'm what's good about these is I'm super interested in reading the next book to figure
Mm-hmm.
out how all this falling out happened and who's on what side, and I'm just really interested in the relationships now. So if anything, it's a
Yes.
great service to the plot. So I think Mark Lawrence really came into his own with this one and vastly improved upon that use of flash forward from Broken Empire to now.
You make a great point about the relationships here. I think that's what's at the core of this book
Mm-hmm.
is the relationships between these, at this point, novices, at least when we're not in the flash forwards, they're novices,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it comes to Nona, Clara, and Ara. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's the heart of this book, the ship heart, if you will.
Oh,
So, hey,
heyo.
so, speaking of relationships, one of Nona's first friendships is with a child named Saida. And something else I think that Mark Lawrence does brilliantly here is he starts you in the point of view not of Nona, who we'll be following for the vast majority of the remainder of this book, but with the point of view of Saida.
Mm-hmm.
And Saida is a child in this Caltus, and somehow she's gotten herself in the situation where she's on death row. And the line that it starts with is, "No child truly believes they will be hanged." And
Yeah.
that's Saida thinking, "Oh, I knew the whole time. This Abbess is coming now." So she sees Abbess class, and she's thinking, "I'm gonna get saved. I knew it. I knew this wouldn't happen
Yeah.
to me." And it's so brilliantly done
Yeah.
because uh, you know that Mark Lawrence, later on you get to figure out, is basically having his main character Nona be saved from death row.
Mm-hmm.
So that feels almost a little tropey, or we've seen these kind of things before, and it, like plot armory, right?
Right.
It okay, of course the main character gets saved at the before they get hanged, but instead he gives us the point of view of Saida, who's this other child, and it's like he reminds you, hey, children do get hanged in this world. It is that brutal. It is that messed up, and I'm gonna start you in her point of view so you empathize with her and think, oh, well, it's not really going to happen. And then it does. She
Yeah.
does get hanged.
He's Lawrence is definitely keeping us on our toes like right out of the gate. Like already we've had a jump in time, we've had totally new characters introduced twice, and now who we believe to be as the main character, who's a child, ends up getting hanged, even with the setup of, oh, this nun is coming to save me. So right in the first couple pages you're like, whoa, Lawrence is throwing a lot at me right now. And if you're someone, like me, who's like hungry to just dive into some fantasy, I was like, man, this is going everywhere. I was really up for it. And that whole play on our expectations of, okay, this is the main character, here's how we're kicking it off, like getting saved from the Hallows kind of a thing. But no, and that's just me being like, okay, I'm I'm reading this with an open mind now, let's see where this goes. And I always pronounced it as Sadia, but uh I'll defer to your pronunciation of Saida. It's just like
Yeah.
Sada or Sadia.
Well, I pulled my typical at this point splitting time between the audiobook and the
Oh, the
paperback
audiobook.
actually here. So I have the paperback and I actually had the audiobook from the first time I uh, read, but at that point mostly listened. Um, so this time I would say I mostly read, but I also listened, and it is Saida according to the audiobook.
Okay, Saida.
So
That's good to know.
yeah, and anyway, Saida unfortunately goes down, and she's Nona's friend. And as we learn throughout this book, friendship means a lot to Nona. The word friend, once it's been uttered to Nona, that comes with all sorts of connotations.
Hmm. Yeah, and this is something about her character that I would maybe have wanted to see more fleshed out. Like, I like that it's that part of her, but I guess I never really understood why. She's so young. She's had, I get it's like, okay, she's had one friend, I suppose, and it's this older juggler guy, and now she's like all in on friendship. I think there was for how much like development and fleshing out we get of the magic system and the school and everything. I kind of felt like I could have used a little more development and why she feels that way.
That's interesting, Charles. I've always thought this was really well done. I so Nona is maybe 8 or 9 by the time she actually doesn't know her age by the time that
Right.
eh, she is sold to Giljan, who's the person who puts her and others in a cage to sell them off to
Right.
to
The
the academy and
yeah, like
to
the child gatherer or something.
yeah. So and it's maybe not delved into in depth, but it is clearly stated that she basically went those first 8 years or whatever without having any friends and being an outcast in the village. And I mean, I would think that 8 years of complete outcastdom, though that's not a word,
Yeah.
and being alienated. Maybe if we spent more time actually seeing it, Charles, you would have
Hmm.
bought into that a little bit more. I found it like, okay, if you're
I
telling me,
believe I was cool
yeah,
with it, but I was also like, she's so adamant about it, and I thought maybe one of these reveals was gonna show us why.
mm,
And while I'm still on board with it. I was like, okay, this is one of those things that I'm just gonna have to accept. And she's 8 years old too, so young to like. And I get that people grow up fast in these kinds of environments, but I was also like, she's very much bought into this and held on to it her whole life. So, very interesting.
yeah. Well, I think that's yeah, interesting. I think agree to disagree on that one
Yeah,
as we'll keep rolling.
yeah, it's
The
minor thing. I'm all on board
yeah.
with Nona.
So then we have Abbess Glass who saves Nona, and this is where things do start to get a little timey-wimey again. Charles, and I thought maybe you'd have some issues with this, but it sounds like you didn't. We get some flashbacks as she's getting taken to Sweet Mercy Convent, which is kind of, oh, here's how I spent this time in Giljon's cage, here's how I
Right.
spent time in the cultist, and here's how I almost killed Raymond Taxis, which is what got her on death row in the first place. So, any thoughts on
I
that
was
you want
fine
to
with it.
discuss?
It's the flash forwards that usually have like the framing story taking place in the future is like the main issue. So like starting off somewhere super interesting and then just going a little bit further back to contextualize it and get us back to where we are. I'm fine with that. And again, this is like the second time skip we've had from Lawrence in the first handful of pages. So I would definitely not recommend Lawrence to first time fantasy readers, but for those veterans, it's so good. It just keeps you on your toes, keeps you fresh, keeps the story going.
Yeah, and then once I get to Red Class over at Sweet Mercy Convent,
Mm,
we don't really get a ton of flashbacks
we
anymore. We do get
no, we
like
don't.
Nona tells the story of the juggler and how she ended up getting sold basically 3 separate times, and each time adding more truth to it until the third time it is the the truth.
Right.
Um, but in almost 500 page book, maybe the latter hundred, or sorry, maybe the latter 350 pages of it, there's only like a couple flashbacks from there. So
Right.
let's get to Sweet Mercy then
Let's
and
do
talk
it.
about Red Class, where Nona's pretty quickly introduced to Clara, who kind of takes the role. We've seen a lot of these school stories, right? King Killer, Harry Potter, whatever.
Right.
So we're used to this kind of setting.
Good old
And
school setting.
yeah, and we're pretty quickly introduced to Clara, who takes the place of the almost what we would think like a Ron Hermione type close friend, or maybe uh, a Sim or a Will from King Killer or whatever, right?
Right, right.
This is the person who, for whatever reason, has taken a quick liking to our protagonist, also is not the spoiled rich kid or anything, and is kind of showing them the ropes and taking them around.
Right. She
Um,
was a family of a wealthy merchant that is in financial trouble, right? So
yes,
she is also kind of poor, which fits along the lines of that humble sidekick friend person, like a Ron Weasley type.
yes. So then that is contrasted by Arabella, who is Arabella Jotsis, and the sis, that those last three letters of the last names of these noble characters, basically, that's going to be there every time you see one of these noble characters. They'll
Hmm.
call them the sis. So that's Jotsis. There was Raymel Taxis, who's the person that Nona almost killed, who's a ring fighter and son of a very, very powerful noble. So whenever you see sis in this book, you know it's one of those noble, wealthy folks. And Ara seems to be slotting in early on to that almost Draco Malfoy,
Exactly. Yeah.
or that Ambrose from the King Killer Chronicle, the
Exactly.
wealthy
The
person
rival.
who is the rival, who is mean spirited and all this kind of stuff. And I think we do end up finding out along the way that both Clara and Ara have a lot more depth than those typical tropes.
That's true. I I find it kind of funny that this book is all about the school setting because I remember when we were preparing for King Killer Chronicles and we read Mark Lawrence's review on Goodreads. Do you remember this? And he was like, "Man, that school setting is really popular these days."
Yes.
And then the next series he writes, what is it but this? So I think he was definitely scouting out what was popular in modern fantasy and decided he was going to play upon this school trope. So going into it, it is kind of interesting how he sets up your expectations for character and dynamics and things, and we readily kind of fall into it. But he does do a good job of swaying us, and it's this trio, this connection that really drives the whole book. I find their relationship, their like triangle relationship, to be super interesting. There's all these moments where Clara like has this kind of love fatuation with Nona, and
Mm.
Nona's like not kind of reciprocating, and she's like kind of choosing between the two, and Claire's trying to just cling on to her. So that dynamic is super interesting, and in the context of how it was set up, of these school setting tropes of like, oh, she's supposed to be the rival, why do you all of a
Yeah.
sudden like her so much, it is super interesting and unique.
Yeah, and we go maybe half the book before where Ara very much seems to be in that role, and
Yeah,
the
there's this thing with like the
way,
knife in the bed and
yes,
all this, and Nona's convinced that Ara's like talking behind her back, making
hmm
jokes because she's still insecure about being like a nobody that came in on like a a child gatherer's cart or something like that.
yeah,
So yeah, she's totally bought into it for a good half the book.
yeah, and I think that while Ara does come in maybe a little spoiled, but not anything outside of what you'd expect for someone with her background,
Right.
uh,
And it would always be
as
Nona walks
she,
into a room and hears the end
yeah,
of a sentence and she takes it as she was just joking about her before she came in.
yeah,
So you get those moments. They compete a little bit. there's the sword and the knife and the dagger in the bed situation.
Yes.
So
So yeah, so there's this moment where it seems like maybe Ara threatened Nona or tried to stab Nona, and there's a dagger in her pillow. Oh, and Nona wakes up to it, but she's not really sure what happened. And because I think this is what Mark Lawrence does this whole time with Ara, is we know to slot Ara into this Ambrose or Draco Malfoy role, so we're right there with Nona of making all these assumptions about what Ara is or isn't doing. So we kind of don't give her the charity principle here
right,
and assume
exactly.
like Ara's doing all these bad things, but we do find out later on that like Ara didn't do that. It was
Yeah,
the Noi Guin, and then when Nona reflects on Ara's the reasons why she didn't like Ara, there's this great quote, which is Ara's crimes appeared to be confined to being beautiful, being born rich, and being the chosen one. Everything
yeah,
else, Nona realized, was something given to her by Clara or something assumed. She had assumed that the remainder of half her jokes were at her expense, that the laughter that faded as she entered the room had been at her. And that gets at exactly what you were talking about, Charles.
exactly.
Like, when you, as the reader, reflect on what did Ara do wrong, once you know that um, that the knife thing was a misunderstanding, especially, you're like, oh wait, Ara's not so bad.
Yeah, exactly. This use of these classism tropes and these school tropes came blended together beautifully for the development of this Nona Ara relationship at the school. So, super interesting.
For sure. And in fact, from Ara's perspective, their like first day, I think it seems like Nona purposefully stole Ara's belt. Though
Yes.
that was also a misunderstanding. And then Ara has to get her head shaved, and she's got like these long golden locks, and
Yeah.
people say she looks like a princess. So that's really rough for Ara to go through. And
Yeah.
then when it turns out the knife thing was misunderstanding too, it's like, which she didn't actually try to exact revenge upon that.
Yeah.
She didn't revenge because of that. So it's like,
Right.
yeah, what did our? So I think I wrote somewhere in our notes hashtag Ara did nothing wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, Ara did nothing wrong. Free Ara, people.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, we talked through a lot of what happens here during Red Class, just through all of that, and we did not mention though that the other Taxis shows up and Nona basically attacks. I think that's Lano Taxis,
Mhm.
and then all of this starts to culminate in a trial, and they put Nona and Abbas Glass on trial. Basically, they're gonna
Oh,
get
yes,
put to
yes.
yeah, they're gonna get put to death for this whole Taxis stuff where
Yeah,
the
basically
Abbas.
the idea of the abbess taking away their
Mhm,
prisoner and
yeah.
holding her makes her guilty, and then the prisoner, who is Nona, still has to get killed. So the church is out for blood for both of them.
hmm And that's led by that high priest at that time
Hmm.
who seems to really dislike Abbess Glass and seems to want to get her done away with. The Abbess then uses some old, I don't know how, old rule, I
Yeah,
guess,
some
of the
law.
church.
Yeah.
Yeah, where she's able to try to prove she's telling the truth by putting her hand to the flame, and she uses some of these tricks that they learn about clarity and stuff to
Serenity.
be able serenity, and she's able to basically just watch her hand burn. And by the way, all the other higher ups in the church were on the abbess's side. So it left this one high priest to just be the reason why Abbess Glass was burning her hand to a crisp.
Right.
Nona so during that, the line is dropped that Nona is supposed to be the shield based on some prophecy,
Right.
and Ara is supposed to be the chosen one in this prophecy. And there's something that the shield can do, or someone who's claimed to be the shield, to prove that they are the shield. It's the ordeal. and Nona says she'll do it because she doesn't want to watch Abbess Glass burn her hand anymore.
Yeah, because it goes into some intense detail, and Glass is really suffering, and everyone's kind of getting queasy watching it, and
Hmm.
so Nona does step in. This whole idea of Nona, she was kind of conflicted at the time, but she comes back to that thing of like, she did save me, and she is nice to me. I would probably consider her a friend. I'll do the trial, whatever. So that gets us to the second like trial within this trial, so we're moving along.
Yep. And Nona has to basically go through 3 rounds of protecting another novice. This is Hessa in this case,
Mm-hmm.
who's also from Giljon's cage and shows magical abilities of a Quantal.
Mm-hmm.
They're the 4 different, like, what do they call? Do they call them races in this?
Like it's
I
always
think they
referred to as
do.
race and blood. Also,
Blood,
you
yeah,
show the blood in you if you do.
yeah,
Um, so
yeah. So there's Hunska, Gerent. Hunskas are fast. Gerents are big. Then there's Quantals who can use the path, and Margils who can do this like shadow
they might be
worky
called
spell
tribes.
magic.
The 4 tribes.
Tribes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Charles.
Mm-hmm.
So then Hessa has Quantal blood, I guess is important for later stuff. And Nona has to protect Hessa to prove that she has these shield abilities, and people basically is the first one a spear that gets thrown, and then there's a throwing star, and
Yep.
then an arrow, and
Yep.
Nona basically stops all of these things in front of a big
At
crowd,
short
and that's
range, also is one
yes,
of the
yeah,
things.
yes, and she does that using her Hunska powers, basically, of being really fast, and in part, what we later learn are Margil powers,
Mm-hmm.
which are her blades that she has these invisible blades that are kind of like claws, which is how she cut Raymel Taxis in the first place. So, anyway, long story short, with the ordeal, Nona is now believed to be the shield, and we learn about some of these uh,
Prophecies.
prophecy things in depth. Charles, what did you think of the prophecy stuff?
It wasn't until we get to that conversation with Abbess Glass and Nona where Glass kind of reveals her hand,
Mm-hmm.
pun intended, to Nona, where 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 she's like, "Look, I don't believe in any of this prophecy mumbo jumbo, but a lot of people do, and it was important for me to gain sympathy in front of all of these super important people, and it was just easier to like have the high priest come in and try and use old laws to get her killed, to then revert that using the sympathy and the trials and all that stuff. So Abbess Glass is basically like, she's part of the prophecy, it's real, and then she burns her hand off, and then Nona kind of takes some serious injuries deflecting the arrow. So Glass was like, yeah, I did all of that, so that was the means to an end, and the means was removing the high priest from office.
Yes.
And once I got to that portion, it became a lot more interesting for me, and it kind of re-solidifies Mark Lawrence's kind of whole philosophy of
Mm-hmm.
fantasy, right? Where not everything is kind of as it reads. These kind of rational minds, this like his scientific background, right? All these rational minds kind of prevail, and technology and realism tends to kind of prevail in his worlds. And he was like, yeah. And Glass was like, yeah, I just wanted to overthrow the high priest, and this was how I could do it. I have no problems using prophecies as tools if gets to the means. And there's that quote she mentions, if you have it, about where she they go on and on about the ends justify the means, basically.
I don't have that quote. I
I'll
assume
look for
it was
it.
during the conversation where Abbess is saying all this, like it's made up, and I know that the she also says the Argatha never created it, but it was concocted decades later by other
Right.
people. So what's interesting too about that is that others, even when they have all the same information as Glass, still choose to believe it. And there's this moment, Wheel is the sister Wheel is the most pious of any of these folks, and she kind of slots into that teacher who hates our main character uh, trope from these stories about schools and fantasy. And Nona says to her that the prophecy's made up, and Wheel says that's what prophecy is. It's something that is made up and that we have faith is true. So I love this chosen one trope use by Lawrence. Like,
Mhm.
Lawrence has us speculating on who is the chosen one between Ara, Nona, and eventually Zol, and all the while is telling us, hey, there is no chosen one. This whole thing is made up. And it plays with our expectations as fantasy readers, because part of us is like, well, even when people don't believe the chosen one is a thing, it kind of is in fantasy,
Yeah.
but it's also Mark Lawrence, and he's saying it's not real, so we're just taken for a ride with
Yeah.
this.
I found the quote, and it happens before the trial, right? And Nona's reflecting on it as Glass is going to take the candle trial. Words are steps along a path. The important thing
Mm,
is to get where you're going. And that's
very,
something that gets repeated a couple times. So kind of basically the ends justify the means. And that's was foreshadowing Abbas Glass's strategy, which was use the sympathy of her getting maimed and
mm-hmm.
these ideas of prophecy to overthrow like the means. And even Nona had this conversation, she was trying to think it out. She was like, what was the means in all of this? And then she was like, oh, you tried to get rid of the high priest. And she was like, yeah, exactly, that was what this was all about. So very interesting. Always fun to see that kind of tropey subversion stuff getting thrown in, and in a world like Mark Lawrence's, it's so honest and
Yeah.
and well structured.
Exactly. And we do get the stage set here for Abyss Glass as this. I don't know if I would quite say Machiavellian, but if the ends justifies the means, that's the first mind that comes up. So I'll say, as this person who is very entrenched in politics and is making lots of moves to try to get what she thinks is best. And it's she did a lot to make this one
And as a leader of a
happen.
church too, which you tend to think is like so bound in faith that they wouldn't necessarily be capable of these things like misusing prophecies for political gain and scheming and things like
Hmm.
that. So in a traditional sense, like in that world, it is very much like the world of politics and religion or and military are all kind of blurred. But our conventional sense of what like a nunnery is and what religion is,
Yeah,
it's kind of played upon here as well in this Abbess Glass character. She's not what you would consider like a pope or the head of a nunnery to be like, you know?
yeah. There's a good moment where they tell the abbess that I think they tell her that they want her to be the new high priest, or at least to be on this like council or whatever it is. And then she's like, politicking isn't for me. And they all
They're
start
laughing,
cracking
yeah.
up.
Right.
Yeah.
I do remember that.
So I think that's pretty much the main stuff that happens in Red Class. We do get Nona and Ara taking their names of Cage and Thorn, respectively. And I know, Charles, you said you kind of forgot about Thorn because there's so much other stuff
For
happening.
sure.
For me, when I first read it, I thought that Nona would be Thorn. And I think that's probably what Mark Lawrence wants you to do is okay, our main character is Nona. The interludes have this future person who is a sister, so she's probably Thorn. And then later on, we find out no, Thorn's Ara, and Nona takes the name of Cage, which
Hmm.
sets us right into this other interlude where we get to see that Sister Thorn is a total badass, first off.
Yes. Yeah.
She takes out tons of people coming at her. And then we find out that a spear comes at her Hunska fast. We know Nona is a Hunska, but we also know some other characters like Clara are Hunskas. And then someone whose name begins with a C
Right, because
takes her down.
Sister Thorn is like she's like doesn't have to be this way. Don't see, and then like it just
Yeah.
shows a C with an asterisk, and
So
then
it's like, cut.
yeah. And I was like, well, it's either Clara or Cage.
Yes.
And I was already suspicious about Clara at this point anyway, because you get so many of these moments where Clara's making these like seemingly not that big of a deal, but really are a big deal gestures like, oh, hey, you could sleep in my bed tonight if there's no other beds available, or oh, hey, we could go hang out and practice together or whatever. And then Nona's like, yeah, I think I'm going to go hang out with Arabella instead. And there were just a couple of those moments woven into this. Plus, constantly Claire is saying these troubling things of like,
Hmm.
oh, money makes the world go round, and then she's spinning from like a penny to a silver coin, and you're at this point you're like, okay, so she's definitely something is going on with Claire here that I'm not 100%
Yeah.
comfortable with. So I was pretty suspicious on Clara, but I was like, it could be Cage, which would be very, very interesting. So who knows?
Yeah. So that was a great use of just what Lawrence had at his disposal by making Cage a name that starts with C and Claire. So it was
And
really well
very
done, I
interesting
think.
use of the
And
book medium as well, of like C
yeah,
dash. You're like, why does
it was well
that wouldn't
done.
work in movies? You'd have to like have a shadowy figure or something.
So
And
yeah,
like,
that's well
no,
said too,
C.
Charles.
It like wouldn't translate, but very
Yeah.
interesting.
So, Charles, you're talking about Clara here and how these hints are dropped throughout, and I think Clara basically gets the opposite treatment of Aura here, where she starts in the friend, like, let's say Ron or Hermione or Will from Kingkiller, and we can slot her in there, but then we start getting these hints that, wait, she might not be as undying, loyal, and friendship focused
Yeah,
as Nona is, or as these tropes we're used to filling Clara's spot is. And I think there's there's great stuff that comes up. Like Kettle says at one point to Nona, "A word to the wise: the hardest lesson I ever learned was that every bad thing you see a friend do to someone else, they will someday do to you.
yeah,
Some people in this world are users and some givers. When two such form a bond, it often ends poorly. Find more friends, Nona. Clara Gomel spends enough time thinking about herself without you to help her do it." And that's
yeah.
pretty early. That's page 159 in my paperback here.
Okay.
So it's not like all this stuff comes out of nowhere. As you're saying, Charles, you do have every reason to be
Yeah.
suspicious of Clara throughout, but it's almost the opposite of that Ara thing where, like, what keeps us from being too suspicious sometimes is that we're like, but Clara's the friend.
Yeah. She plays the like Ron Weasley role. It's like Harry's not gonna all of a sudden be buddy buddy with Draco and forget about Ron,
Yeah,
which is
yeah,
kind of what's happening in this version of how the tropes are being used. Yeah, I got that. I always suspected her though, like too many of those moments throughout the whole
yeah.
book for me to ever fully buy into the fact that she'll like in the 11th hour be truly the good friend and that someone else betrayed them, but it was always possible. And
Well, we
with this
know.
flash forward, which again was another good use of bending time, which I'd come into this as being very hesitant, I actually really quite enjoyed that C dash. So
Yeah, good
moment.
on you,
I was
Charles.
like, okay.
You're loving it.
And also, it gives a little more insight into like the dynamic that's being played in the red class right now has these huge effects as they grow into
Hmm.
adults. So it's like, oh, what happens between their childhood and adulthood? What is this falling out moment that one is killing another one? So all that was really good use of that flash forward and time warping. And like you said at the beginning of this episode, it all comes down to the relationship dynamic of these characters that drives it.
Exactly. And you did mention the asking Noah to come into bed with her and stuff. I
Yeah,
think that seems to be coming from like Clara very obviously has like romantic feelings for
for
Nona.
sure.
I don't think that was necessarily a part of anything more elaborate than
She just had
that.
a crush on her. It's young
Yeah.
love, and she's kind of being like, you can come here. And this was like like put up right against the scene of two girls sharing a bed and like rubbing feet and
Hmm.
stuff in a very like sensual way or whatever, like just like a
Yeah.
companion way. And it was very understated, but still like very obvious these two things are happening at the same time. And Nona was like pretty uncomfortable about it, and then Ara was like, oh, there's an empty bed next to me. She's like, see ya, pew, and
Mm.
like leaves Clara alone. And after, when you have a moment of you just became vulnerable and then you get rejected, that could kind of pile on to how you could eventually stab someone in the future.
Yeah, or prick them with a needle that has poison on it.
Yes, or
So,
poison them for sure.
yes.
What is it? What is it? Hell have no fury like a lover scorned. What's that phrase?
Sure. And we then move on to Gray class, and we that's we've got Nona's aged up, as are the rest. Nona's more like 12 now, and we have Shirzal, who's the Emperor's sister, coming with Zol and Yisht, who are two ice tribers, and this this sets a stage for a lot of what happens in the next half of this book, Charles. I see Uriah's getting. Uriah loves this part of the book.
Skin, yeah. She'll quiet down.
And yeah, any thought we get Zol and Nona fighting? Nona loses, but Ara walks the path. Nona gets whipped. Nona also walks the path in her own anger-fueled way. That's kind of what's happening during this trip. Anything to say on all this, Charles?
Not so much. I just find it interesting that it was very much like a WWF ring with the stanchions all along the outside of the border that you can kind of bounce back from, and I was like, okay, interesting. And then we had like what is it called, the blade path back at the convent.
Yeah.
That's like basically like American Ninja Warrior kind of like setup
Yeah.
there. So I was like, okay, we're going from American Ninja Warrior to WWF. Very exciting stuff going on. But for the most part, I thought this middle section of like all the training and the tournaments and stuff was the most kind of draggy portion of the whole thing. I was kind of ready to get more into the mystery and the character relationships than I was like, and then this battle, and then that battle, and then this battle. And I was like, okay, I was ready to move on, back to the convent.
That's fair, Charles. I did get some of that feeling myself when we were going through. So we go to the Countess, where there's that other instance with Raymol, which I think we kind of need. We need another Raymol interaction, just because that is the through line through this whole thing. The way it ends, basically, besides the relationships, is that Nona does eventually get revenge on Raymol. So I think we do need that moment.
Right, and it shows that there's something going on with him where he's cut, and he doesn't bleed, and he doesn't take damage like a normal person would. There's some and we know that it took a lot of magic to keep him alive, so it was good to see that kind of getting put in place for the ultimate face-off at the end, where we see just how truly like unstoppable he is from this magic. So it does, you're right, remind us of him, replant those seeds, all that good stuff.
Definitely. So I think we needed it. It's the same kind of thing. She goes to the academy and she finds out that she's got Margil blood. That's what the blades are. So we find out that Nona's a 3 blood, and that's important for this, because the prophecy has this whole the 4 voices will speak at once bit going, and people think that means that a 4 blood is the chosen one. That's the shtick of it. And we think, oh, maybe Nona she's got 3, maybe she's got a 4th, but she's pretty small, so the Jaren thing seems unlikely. Then we end up with, after that interaction with Raymol, Nona might be poisoned, and she goes to try to steal ingredients to get a cure. She sees Yish doing some sketchy digging and speculates that she might be trying to steal the ship heart. Then, go to the academy, or that's where the Margil stuff happened, at the academy.
Yeah,
they plan to put Yisht in a barrel is the next. And I think like this is kind of the feel of these events. It's like, okay, now this thing's happening, now that thing's happening. It does set the stage.
Yeah, meanwhile, there's all this training stuff, all the classes at the school and all this other stuff, and you're like, okay. And they tried to put Yish in a barrel.
And ship her away with
I like
line.
that. That's such like a 10-year-old
Yeah.
like kind of mentality. It's like, we won't kill her. We'll put her in a barrel and ship her away. I was like, am I really reading this? It's kind of fun.
Yeah, it does feel true.
There's some innocence
Sometimes,
about that plan, you know?
yeah. Yeah. Meanwhile, Clara is like, just kill her. But
Yeah.
the rest of them are still a little more innocent. And they do put her in a barrel and they do ship her away. And it sort of works.
Right.
It doesn't long term, but. That's what happens when you put a bunch of 12-year-olds together and have them come up with a plan.
Yeah. Exactly. The fact that they were able to pull it off was fortunate enough for them.
So it, yeah, I think that's pretty much that middle portion. Things start to get really picked up again when they go out on the ranging. And that's basically that they get dropped off somewhere and have to go to a particular destination.
I can't believe the
And
nuns thought that was a good idea. They're like, okay, everyone out into the wilderness unprotected.
well, it's a long standing tradition that happens every year, and they do take precautions here to have very seasoned warriors guarding all the three most important people, which story wise feel like it's typically the most important people are Nona, Ara, and Clara, but in the actual plot, the most important people to the nunnery are Nona, Ara, and then Zol,
Right.
who is revealed to be a four-blood during this ranging. Kettle gets poisoned. Nona finds her, and Kettle's like, the rest of you are just distractions. Like, the real chosen one is Zol.
Mm-hmm. That was an interesting
that?
little reveal. Like I feel like to get us to the ranging part was kind of a stretch. Like, yeah, okay, like let's send them out ranging. It's a tradition, whatever. But still, I was like, come on. Like, I think the circumstances are a little bit different for this troop, but they tried to bring some sisters to follow them, and that was a nice little reveal too. It's like, oh, each of you had someone following you. And then there was this whole thing of, back when what's her name, Vasca, the one that tried to steal the ship heart, Venka.
Oh, Yisht.
Yisht. Why did I think it was?
I think you're
something with
naming a
V?
character from the Poppy War.
Oh,
Venka?
yeah. So Yisht was trying to steal the ship heart, and they were like, "We should just tell the abbess. We should just tell her." Which I was like, "Yeah, that's obviously the right thing to do." But she was out of town, and so it's like, okay, well, at least that makes some sense. Like, so when they decided not to tell her, I was like, "That kind of doesn't make sense." And then Nona was like, "You know what? I should tell her." And I was like, okay, good. And then it's like, oh, she's out of town. I'm like, oh, that's smart, Lawrence. Like, good idea to have her not be there for whatever reason. And maybe we'll learn more about what she's up to in future books. But for now, I thought it was a good way to kind of justify some more of the stuff that's going on. Because like the minute you realize Yish is trying to steal the ship heart and they're all connected, you probably wouldn't just immediately be like, time to go ranging. So you'd probably kind of investigate and see what happens. So that was kind of my qualms going into this. But once we were there, like the pacing of the book really took off, and I really enjoyed reading all of these ranging moments. I love, again, coming back to the setting, I love this idea of this like ice corridor, and like they just don't understand the technology of the lens and the sun, and they just know that it carves this one warm path into the glaciers that they live in. Very, very cool. So, and that's also a pun. So
cool as in
yeah.
cold.
Yeah.
Oh, Charles,
you guys got to keep up here. So I really enjoyed the ranging portion once we got off into it, and you put all the relationships that all these classmates built, and you put them out on their own against all the odds, and you see how they handle it, and that's when the pacing really started to move for me.
Yeah, I would agree. The ending, I think, of this book is really strong.
Yeah.
I do love they're going out on the they're going out to the ranging, and Clara just starts like mumbling to herself and those around her about how money makes the world go round and she's going to make something of herself, and everyone's like, what do you do? Like, why are you saying all this? And she's like, you don't know if you're going to come back, so you might as well say what you got to say. And it's more, it's like, okay, Clara, let's keep in mind, is about 12 at this time, so maybe she's not the best at keeping
Well, they
her
might be.
betrayal
I think they're
secret.
gray
And
class at this point, right? And that's a little
yeah,
older. They're like 14.
I don't think so yet.
I thought
I
gray
think
class
they're
was
more
like
like
13,
12, 13.
14.
Maybe I'm
Whatever.
wrong.
Who cares? It's like a difference of a
Either
year.
way,
Of
yeah, either way,
13.
teenagers,
Yeah.
early teenager, probably not going to be great at keeping secrets either.
No.
Um, so we are, yeah, we're getting some hints pretty blatantly, and so is Nona, which is pretty important because we end up in this situation where they're all in a cave. Like our main characters are all in a cave, and the Taxis soldiers are surrounding this cave, and they want vengeance upon, or really, the Taxis in charge of them, Raymel.
Hmm.
They want vengeance upon Nona in particular, but they tricked Clara into basically selling people out and then poking them with a poison that would disable everyone from fighting back.
Right.
Um, by telling her that they actually wanted Aura. And Clara, as we find out throughout this book, she has some negative feelings toward Aura. It's complicated for sure,
Hmm.
but definitely doesn't value her friendship as much as she values Nona. And there's some sense here that maybe Clara wouldn't have done it if it was Nona, but maybe she would have. And
Maybe,
we
but
don't know.
but Clara was like, Nona's supposed to get away, and Aura's the one that gets
Yeah.
taken, and that was the deal. So she made the
Yeah.
deal assuming that Nona would be safe. So
Yes.
I'm of the belief that she just really didn't like Aura and still kind of wanted to make it work with Nona. So
Hmm.
I'm on board with that. And it seems like something
Okay.
a 14-year-old would do because
Yeah.
she does kind of have a crush on Nona a little bit. And then also, Aura comes from the nobility, and Claire's family has had money
Hmm.
problems. So I just think she hated pretty much everything about Aura, from her wealth to her status to her
Yep.
seemingly how she gained friendship with Nona. That's kind of putting a shadow over Claire's relationship with Nona. So I kind of am of the belief that she kind of wants Nona all to herself a little bit at this point.
And I've read through all this, so I'm also trying to be very careful in my wording. I think if Charles is free to make more clear just
Yeah.
speculations of what will happen in the future than I am, so I'm always interested to hear that. It's yeah, it's an interesting and well built toward. I don't even really want to call it a twist, because in part what happens is Nona had this black cure prepared, and Nona, like us, has picked up on all of these signs from Clara, and she's like, something's not right here.
Yeah.
And Nona takes the black cure to prepare herself because she'd also smelt the like cat piss smell
Mhm.
on Clara way back, which she knows is that, I think, boneless poison.
Yeah.
So Nona's like, okay, I'm just going to take this thing and be ready if Clara's going to use that poison on me. And it ends up making Nona actually resistant to it and able to fight back in this moment. So I think in that way, it's almost like not quite a twist.
Right.
I don't know how you'd describe
it,
it,
wa-
Charles.
it for me, had suspected it from halfway through the book, so it wasn't so much a twist as it was this kind of revelation. It was presented like a twist, though, honestly, and then like all this stuff that we afterwards, right after the twist is
Yeah.
air quotes, is revealed. Then Nona's like, oh yeah, I suspected her this whole time. It's like, we didn't know you suspected her this whole time, and the story's being told through your perspective. Like, you weren't thinking about how she mysteriously took extra ingredients and the smell was suspicious and all this other stuff. You're not telling us this until after the twist is revealed. It's like, I get it in that you didn't want to spoil that reveal, but it also kind of felt like, yeah, okay, how would we have ever known that if you hadn't written it in, so. And then like, oh, she takes it preemptively because she suspected her the whole time. It's like, maybe weave more of that suspicion into it because she's so steadfast. Friends do everything for friends, and she had no problems with suspecting her enough to take this really deadly poison.
So, well, Charles, let me. I
Weigh
think.
in.
Well, my first part is I think I 90% agree with you,
Okay.
and that is that. Yeah, with this tight a point of view to Nona, I would say that we should get more of this stuff beforehand rather than all of it kind of thrown at us right at the end. And I
After
think,
the reveal, yeah.
yeah, after the reveal. And I also kind of think that if you're not suspecting Clara by this point, I don't want to say you're not paying attention, but there are a lot of
For
opportunities to
sure.
start
For sure.
suspecting Clara.
For sure.
So it's like, I don't know. I don't know if it needed to lean on that twist. Like maybe we should have just gotten that information, like you're saying, Charles, up front, and
That's
that
what
should
I'm
just been a
saying.
thing that played out. Um, as for Nona not trusting her friend, I think we also get the reveal that her first ever friend betrayed her basically and was there to try to turn her into someone,
Hmm.
right? That juggler. So I think that's the 10% I'm not with you on, which is I like that Nona ends up actually not trusting her friend after
Yeah.
all of this time because of her past
Ultimately, I'm
experiences.
super excited by everything that happened. I just felt like the experience was kind of lessened by giving us all this stuff that she had felt the whole time that we never knew immediately
Yeah.
after the reveal. You know, like you said at the beginning, there's more than enough reasons to suspect Clara, and the fact that Nona goes from friendship or like ride or die friendships to suspecting her to the point of taking this really deadly poison is an interesting one. And maybe I would have liked to have seen more of that struggle, like that decision to drink this really dangerous
Hmm.
potion that everyone's like, oh, I'd rather die than take that
Yeah.
potion. Like to see her decide that just on the chance that Clara might betray her, that's an interesting moment that we really didn't get because of this attempt to save the reveal, which it felt kind of weird to me. It felt like I got a little behind the curtain into the writing process with those moments, whereas everything else had me kind of enraptured. That moment, I was like, it's kind of like justifying the twist.
That's fair, Charles.
So that's all I'm going to say about it. I
Yeah.
really liked it, though, and I would have liked to have seen that moment where Nona drinks the poison. You know, because it's like, man,
Hmm.
you have to really believe someone's going to poison you if you're going to take it.
Yeah.
And
That
it does mess
that's
her up,
true.
right? Her eyes get.
Yeah, her eyes get completely black after that. So just no no difference between pupil and otherwise. It's just
Yeah.
black eyes at this point. So that's interesting, and I think it's very true to finishing off Clara's arc in Red Sister while leaving this room to okay, did she really want to betray Nona? Because Nona speculates on, hey, if they told her it was me, would the price have gone up or gone
Yeah,
down
right.
for what Clara would be willing to take? But she doesn't even consider would she have said no. Like,
Yeah.
so Nona it disagrees with you, Charles, in Red Sister, thinks that Clara would have betrayed her. It just might have changed the price.
Well,
So,
this was a betrayal also.
yes,
Getting poisoned in the first place is a huge
for sure.
betrayal. Um, so, yeah.
But different levels of
Different
betrayal to
levels.
turn her
Yeah,
over
yeah.
to the Taxes than
Would
to
she accept the
temporarily.
price? Yeah. I
So
bet it would have to go
it
up.
leaves, I would think at least, yeah, and I think it leaves room for what we get later and what we'll get to that last epilogue in the future where this obviously is more open ended. So then we get this awesome showdown.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I should start with Nona tells her true story of why she got sold. That
Yeah.
included the reveals and that Nona killed a bunch of people with her blades and all this stuff. And we also get then Yisht has returned because all you did was send her off in a
Yeah.
barrel for a few
They put
days.
Yisht in a barrel.
Yes. And then Hessa tries to fight Yisht off. Nona, through their path connection, is able to witness this, which is an interesting use of POV, I think. And then Hessa dies. Nona cut away her shadow. That doesn't have a ton of
Yeah.
ramifications yet. And then we end up from there. The fight with Raymel and his troops. His troops is where it starts.
Right. And I like this battle. You know, you slowly start to see more of like how he's indestructible. And I like the moment where all the girls come out of the cave with weapons and
Yes.
start like trying to hit him, and he's like, get off, and he like throws them all around. That would have been that's a great TV moment. I'd love to see that
Yeah,
on the screen.
me too.
This giant
Uh,
juggernaut of a person fueled by like devil demons, I guess,
yeah.
and he can't be killed. And these girls are running up with these weapons, weight that don't belong to them, and start like trying to hack them up. It's fun.
It was great. Before that, we do get Nona using some path abilities
Mhm.
to take out a ton of soldiers
Yes.
and lightning quick. So she's got these path and
Kind of
Hunska
alarming
powers
her
going.
approach because, you know, the nuns constantly teach like
Hmm.
patience, serenity, and she's like, and even in the beginning of this book, they say like fighting is about control. You know, that was a huge part of the beginning of the nuns training her. And then she's all just like, I can't do any of that. This only works if I'm really mad, just barreling forward
Yep.
like juggernaut style. And that's where she kind of finds her groove and is able to unleash all of this devastation.
Yeah, and it is interesting with Nona where you get these parts of her character fleshed out more where she's saying, yeah, at my core, I'm a monster. Like, if you heard my real story, which you will now, you'll see that I am just awful because that's how she views herself. We might disagree.
Right.
And she views herself that way as this person just pretending to be normal this whole time, but deep down she just lusts for violence, which raises some interesting
Exactly.
questions almost along the same lines of our what makes a monster
And
conversation that we
along the
had
lines of our
a while
Poppy
back.
Wars conversation, where like how much of
Mm,
these things are we proud of her for, and how much of these are
yeah.
warning signs that we should be concerned about her, you know, because she is like tapping into just pure anger and using that to kill a lot of people. So is that personal growth, or is that something kind of alarming? Are we making a monster here?
You make some really good points there, Charles, and I'll just refrain from getting too into that. But
I know just
we
coming
have,
off of Poppy Wars, like anytime a
yeah,
character kind of progresses through just embracing violence, like that's not a great thing. It's great in terms of keeping you and your friends alive in this moment, but it's kind of troubling if that's how you solve your problems.
yeah. Well, Charles, to that point, there's a quote in on page 87 of my paperback where Nona says, or her internal monologue is, anger had its place. It was a weapon not to be neglected, but so did patience, and Nona decided that control lay in deciding which to use and when. So, Charles, will Nona be able to maintain that control long term? Stay tuned. But
Right. And I think I highlighted something probably right after that where she's like, fighting is about control, control of your fear, your pain, and your anger, control of your
mhm.
weapon and your opponent, blah, 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 blah. And that's actually the lesson that she's hearing in like her first Blade class. So, uh, very
Mm.
interesting stuff. Fighting is about control of your anger. Will that theme play out now that she just lets her anger get unleashed? Are we going to learn more about controlling that, or just embracing it? Who knows?
Mm. Well said, Charles. Well, we get this big fight with Raymol. All the we get Darla and Jula and Ruli and then Ara all kind of unleashing everything they have on him
Yeah.
to which works to various extents but not really. And then he's got this big red eye that gets revealed in the middle of the fight. It was very cinematic, as you were saying, Charles.
Right.
I really enjoyed reading this part. It was very visual in my head. And eventually Nona is able to use that amulet thing and
Yeah.
is able to kill Raymol, who's been screaming like, I can't be killed, they won't let me.
Yeah. They won't let
die,
me, which was a very
demons.
troubling thing to hear.
That it
But it
was.
was so much fun. I was like, they won't let you, like maybe hinting that you kind of want to die.
Yes.
So
So we get an idea of that maybe his life has gotten pretty tortured since the mages brought him back from the brink of death.
mhm.
And it makes even more sense why he wants vengeance upon Nona, because not only did she just almost kill him and now he's fine, she almost killed him and now his life might be pretty torturous because he's possessed by all of these demons.
Right.
And that whole "they won't let me" bit, like you said, Charles, it definitely sticks with you.
There was some weight to that line for sure. I really liked it.
Yeah. So we see the end of Raymel Taxis. We get the sense from what comes up next, the epilogue, that this is not the end of the feud with Nona and the Taxis family. So it's pretty interesting. We get what Sister Cage, or Nona, has become, which is some sort of legendary, feared person, I guess, who
Sure.
these novices have heard rumors about, and they're like, oh, they're all true. She's that frightening. And then people literally just run from her. Some of these soldiers will just run, seeing Nona and her lack of a shadow and her completely black eyes. And then she comes up to Clara, who's standing over Ara, who's basically nearly bleeding out at this point, but she's still alive. And then they have a conversation basically about friendship,
Yeah.
which is interesting. Right after Nona comes out, just this fearsome person, and Clara.
And they switch back to their, Nona, and like the
Yes,
name Nona comes back at these moments, weaved in and out with Cage. So
exactly. There's such a great exchange that I love here, because we also get Nona, even if she suspected that her friend was going to betray her, she did not do anything to harm Clara after that, because friendship does mean so much to Nona.
right, and she
And
doesn't buy in that Clara's like unredeemable at this
yeah,
point, even though she basically skewered Ara. It's like, okay, you still want to give her a chance? All right, good on you.
yeah. And there's this great exchange where Clara says, "We were children, Nona. Children make and break friendships all the time. It's not important. This, what we're doing now, this is important. It's about sides in the great game that's being played, and you're on the wrong one, the losing one. You should change sides." Nona shook her head. "I'm not playing, and I've always been on your side, Clara. You've just not properly understood it." And isn't that kind
It's
of
so
at
good.
the core of, we say this book's about relationships? That exchange there, Clara and Nona, where Clara still wants to be friends or be on the same side with Nona. Like, Clara seems to really value Nona in some way, even if she was willing to make that betrayal. And Nona says, "Look, like, I don't care about anything bigger than that. I've always been on your team here, Clara, and you just don't seem to get it." And I just love that exchange, Charles.
Me too. I love that flash forward, and I think that's what has me so excited for Grey Sister is this idea of these relationships and how did we get here. And like the flash forward does such a good service to their relationship because like I've always been on your side. You never know. And it's like you're on the losing side of, so like there's this greater conflict that we still get to
Mm-hmm.
understand, and there's all this, it's rooted in these like almost innocent-esque childhood friendships that have gone on to go through the ringer that is adulthood and this really harsh setting that Lawrence created. And I'm just really excited to see where it goes. Brilliant use of the flash forward and brilliant use of the school setting to create these really awesome relationships.
And brilliant book, Charles. When I've been reading this, I think I vaguely remembered that I must have really loved this book, but I think I forgot how much I love this book, because I don't know, I was enraptured. It's like so good. This might rank up higher among my favorite fantasy novels than I remembered. So I'm really enjoying this.
Me too. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking at the release schedule. We might have to take a break from Book of the Ancestor to get in Poppy War, but we'll finish Poppy War and then we'll come back with Book of the Ancestor, and I'm very excited about that.
For sure, Charles. And this is something for us to work out off the air, but there's a short story called Bound that's in between books 2 and 3 that's only like 40 some odd pages. So maybe we won't have to take that break after all.
Between
we'll
books
talk
2
about
and
this.
3. Okay.
Yeah, like maybe we'll release Bound. I don't want to make any promises for our listeners, but let's talk about if we can read through Bound and try to release that as well, so the buddy read continues.
All right, the buddy read continues. And yeah, anything else before we bring it home?
Nah, just pumped here, Charles. I'm loving this.
I'm loving this too. It's good to be back. It's been years since I've read Mark Lawrence, and I didn't realize how much I missed him until now. So let's get some music going. Thank you, everyone, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. This has been your co-hosts and lifelong friends, Charles and Dylan. If you like what you heard today, go ahead, find us on Apple Podcasts and toss 5 stars to our podcast, guys. We also are available wherever else you can download podcasts for the most part, all the popular ones anyway. Go ahead, if you know how to listen to us, you made it to the end of the episode. So go ahead and find us on social media. Just Google Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. We come right up. Find us Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all that stuff.
You don't even have to write podcast, I think.
Yeah.
Just Friends Talking Fantasy.
You know we got that SEO on fleek. And go ahead and drop us some comments, drop us some reviews, send us an email, theftfpodcast@gmail.com. Let us know what you think of all these stories, these conversations, these episodes. We'd love to hear from you.
Or something else you want us to cover,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, let us know. What do you want to see?
Like
send us stuff. Let us know what you want to hear. We'll bring it to you, the fan, because we love you guys. And just always appreciate the thoughts. So as always, everyone, go forth and conquer, friends.